It was a life painted in sunlight. Elara often thought of it that way. A series of sun-drenched canvases depicting a love so perfect it felt almost stolen from a dream. Their apartment, a high-ceilinged haven overlooking the city's greenest park, was always filled with light, glinting off the polished hardwood floors and warming the soft cream-colored linens on their bed. Here, with Leo, laughter was the most common currency. It echoed in the hallways as he chased her with a damp dish towel, spilled into the quiet moments as they shared a bottle of wine on their small balcony, and settled into a gentle hum as they lay tangled together. The city lights a distant, glittering tapestry below. Leo was her anchor and her wing. With his easy charm and a smile that could disarm armies, he had swept into her life and made it a home. He saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else ever had. He celebrated her quirks, soothed her anxieties, and championed her dreams with a fierce loyalty that made her feel invincible. His love was the foundation upon which she was building her world. And at the center of that world, her proudest creation, aside from their marriage, was the Bloom Box. It had started as a whisper of an idea, a small stall at a weekend farmer's market where she sold hand-tied bouquets, each one a unique story told in petals and leaves. But her passion was a wildfire. Fueled by Leo's encouragement and a small loan, it grew into a charming brick-and-mortar shop on a cobblestone street, its windows overflowing with hydrangeas, peonies, and wild, untamed ferns. The air inside was a heady perfume of damp earth, fresh-cut stems, and blooming potential. It was more than a business. It was the physical manifestation of her soul. It was where her artistry, her love for nature's untamed beauty, found its voice. It was hers. The first sign of a storm on this perfect horizon was always subtle, a chill in the air that only Elara seemed to notice. It had a name. Eleanor. Leo's mother was a woman carved from ice and old money, a matriarch who ruled her social and financial empire with a velvet-gloved iron fist. She was beautiful, impeccably dressed, and possessed a poise that could make royalty feel inadequate. When she spoke, her voice was low and melodic, but her words were like precisely aimed darts, tipped with a poison that seeped in slowly. "Elara, my dear Eleanor," had said during her first, meticulously orchestrated visit to the Bloom Box, her eyes sweeping over the rustic wooden shelves and galvanized steel buckets. "This is all so quaint. How wonderful for you to have such an absorbing little hobby." The word hobby hung in the fragrant air, a deliberate dismissal of the 60-hour weeks, the sweat, the sacrificed weekends. Elara had forced a smile, her hands tightening on her shears. "It's a growing business, Eleanor. I'm hoping to hire my first employee next month." Eleanor had simply smiled, a placid, unreadable expression. Of course, dear. Ambition is so admirable in your circumstances." Leo, standing beside her, had squeezed Elara's shoulder, oblivious. "Isn't it great, Mom? She built this all from nothing." He was proud. His love a shield, he thought, was protecting her. But Elara knew it was a prism, one that bent his mother's words, softening their sharp, cruel edges into something he could dismiss as a generational quirk. The visits and phone calls followed a similar pattern. Eleanor's compliments were always backhanded, her questions designed to undermine. "That dress is lovely, Elara. It's amazing what you can find off the rack these days." Or, "Are you sure you want to invest your profits back into the shop? Leo's portfolio is performing so well. Perhaps you should let him handle your pocket money." Each remark was a small, calculated chip at Elara's confidence, a reminder of her humble origins, a stark contrast to the Vancroft dynasty from which Leo hailed. She came from a world of loving, hard-working people who valued character over capital, a world Eleanor viewed as a charming but ultimately inferior diorama. Elara tried to talk to Leo about it, late at night when the city was asleep. "It's just the way she is, Ellie," he would murmur, pulling her closer. "She's from a different era. She doesn't mean anything by it. She just wants to make sure we're secure." But Elara felt the meaning in every syllable. She saw the way Eleanor's eyes would flick over her, a silent, meticulous, appraisal that always found her wanting. She was an outsider in their gilded world, a wildflower brought into a sterile, manicured garden, and Eleanor was the head gardener, seers in hand, waiting for the right moment to prune her away. Still, in the sanctuary of their apartment, with Leo's arms around her, Elara could almost believe him. She would look at his sleeping face, the lines of worry smoothed away, and tell herself that their love was strong enough to weather any storm. Im. She had her dream, and for now, it felt like enough. She was happy. She was loved. She was living in a beautiful, sunlit cage, unaware that the hand holding the key belonged to her. The Sunday family dinner at the Vancroft estate was not a meal. It was a theatrical performance, and Eleanor was its sole director. The mansion stood on a hill, overlooking the city, a monument of cold stone and sprawling lawns, manicured with surgical precision. Inside, the air was still and cool, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old money. Ancestral portraits with severe, judgmental eyes lined the grand staircase, their gazes following Elara as she walked beside Leo, her hand clutching his as if it were a lifeline. Tonight, the dining room was a battlefield disguised in crystal and silver. The long mahogany table was a polished expanse of dark water, reflecting the cold, glittering light of the chandelier above. Each place set in was a fortress of cutlery and glassware. Elara felt like a fraud, a commoner dressed in borrowed finery. Her simple navy dress a stark contrast to Eleanor's jewel-toned silk gown. The passive-aggressive barbs that had once been whispers now became the evening's main topic of conversation. Eleanor waited until the soup course, a chilled cucumber bisque that tasted of nothing, to make her opening move. "Leo, darling," she began, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "I was speaking with the Barclays today. Their son, Richard, just made partner at his law firm. They're buying a summer home in the Hamptons. It's so important to be making the right moves at your age." The implication was clear. Leo was a successful architect, but in Eleanor's world, his success was merely adequate. The unspoken addendum was that his marriage to Elara was not one of the right moves. Leo shifted uncomfortably. "That's great for Richard. My firm just landed the museum redesign." "Mom, it's a huge project." "Yes, of course," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with condescension. "A public works project. Very noble, but it's the private contracts, the ones that build legacies, that truly matter." She then turned her gaze to Elara, a predator locking onto its prey. "And your little flower shop, Elara, how is that? Blooming?" The other guests, a curated collection of Eleanor's sycophantic friends, chuckled politely. Elara felt a hot flush creep up her neck. She set her spoon down with a quiet click. "It's doing very well, thank you. We've secured the floral contracts for 3 major weddings this season, including the mayor's daughter." She met Eleanor's gaze, her own voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Eleanor's smile tightened. "Weddings. How lovely. Such a fleeting business, isn't it? Tied to the whims of blushing brides." She took a delicate sip of wine. "I do hope you have a solid business plan, dear. It would be such a shame for Leo to have to bail out a failing venture. It could reflect so poorly on the family name." This was it, the direct assault she had always dreaded. The air crackled with tension. This was no longer a subtle jab. It was a public declaration of war. Elara looked to Leo, her eyes pleading with him to step in, to defend her. To defend, asterisk. She saw the conflict warring on his face, the furrow in his brow, the tightening of his jaw. He loved her. She knew he did. But he was also his mother's son, raised in the shadow of this formidable woman, conditioned his entire life to seek her approval. "Mom," he started, his voice strained. "Elara is a fantastic businesswoman. She's incredibly talented. Talent doesn't pay the mortgage on a prime piece of real estate." "Leo," Eleanor countered smoothly, not even glancing at her son. Her eyes remained fixed on Elara. "Passion is a luxury. Legacy is built on shrewd, calculated decisions. on alliances, on marrying well. The final two words landed like a slap. The insult was no longer veiled. It was laid bare on the polished table for everyone to see. Elara's background wasn't just a curiosity to Eleanor. It was a stain on the family's pristine porcelain reputation. Elara felt her breath catch in her throat. She was speechless, wounded not just by Eleanor's cruelty, but by the silence that followed. She looked at Leo again. This was his moment to stand up, to draw a line in the sand, and declare whose side he was on. He opened his mouth, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought it would, but then he closed it, his shoulders slumping in a barely perceptible gesture of defeat. He picked up his wine glass. "Mom's just being pragmatic, Elara," he said, his voice low, avoiding her gaze. "She's from the old school. She worries, that's all." The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. He wasn't just failing to defend her, he was defending his mother. He was asking her to absorb the poison, to accept the insult, to understand. In that moment, the first significant crack appeared in the foundation of their perfect life. It was a hairline fracture, but Elara knew, with a sickening certainty, that it ran deep. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of polite conversation that felt like screams to her ears. Elara moved her food around her plate, the taste of ashes in her mouth. The car ride home was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. The city lights streaked past the windows, but the warmth and magic were gone. They were just cold, distant points of light in an overwhelming darkness. When they finally got back to their sun-drenched apartment, it felt different. The light seemed harsh, the shadows longer. Leo began, reaching for her. She flinched away, the first time she had ever recoiled from his touch. "Don't," she whispered, her voice raw. "Please, just don't." He stopped, his hand dropping to his side. She didn't mean it the way it sounded. "How did she mean it, Leo?" Elara asked, her back to him, as she stared out at the park, her own reflection, a ghostly stranger in the glass. "When she said I was a poor alliance, that my business was a liability, that I wasn't marrying well material. Please, translate for me. Tell me the hidden compliment I missed." "You're twisting her words," he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "She's protective. It's how she shows she cares. She cares about her name, her status, and her control." Elara shot back, finally turning to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of anger and hurt. "And tonight, you let her walk all over me. You let her humiliate me. You sat there and told me she was just being pragmatic. You chose her, Leo?" He had no answer. The crack in the porcelain had just widened into a chasm, and they stood on opposite sides. The comfortable, easy love that had once bridged all distances now seeming impossibly far away. The attack, when it came, was not a single, crushing blow, but a symphony of destruction conducted with the chilling precision of a maestro. Eleanor did not just want to wound Elia. She wanted to erase her, to methodically dismantle every pillar of the life she had so carefully built, until nothing but rubble remained. It began on a Tuesday. Elara was humming to the radio, her hands wrist-deep in a bucket of cool water, stripping thorns from a batch of deep crimson roses. The morning light streamed through the front window of the bloom box, illuminating the dancing dust motes and making the shop feel like a cathedral of her own making. That's when the man in the drab city-issued polo shirt walked in, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. He handed her an envelope. Inside, a bright red notice of violation informed her that her shop was in breach of a zoning ordinance from 1973, one so obscure and archaic it seemed impossible. The violation, her hand-painted sign, the one Leo had helped her hang, was apparently 3 inches too wide. The notice came with an immediate order. She had 48 hours to vacate the premises. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her disbelief. She spent the rest of the day on the phone, a frantic, fruitless series of calls to the city planning department. She was met with a wall of automated menus, hold music, and unhelpful clerks who spoke of insurmountable paperwork and non-negotiable fines. It felt coordinated. It felt impossible. She called Leo, her voice trembling. "He was in a meeting," he said. He sounded distant. "Distracted? A zoning violation. I'm sure it's just a mistake, Ellie. I'll look into it when I get home." But he didn't sound convincing. There was a new, unsettling note of resignation in his voice. The second movement of the symphony began the next morning. An email from her primary supplier of exotic orchids, a Dutch family she had built a wonderful relationship with, landed in her inbox. With profuse and unconvincing apologies, they were terminating their contract, effective immediately, due to unforeseen logistical restructuring. An hour later, her landlord, a kindly old man who had always praised her business, called to say that his bank was suddenly threatening to call in his commercial loan unless he severed his lease with her. His voice was full of genuine regret, but his hands were tied. He had no choice. Every door was slamming shut in her face, sealed by a force she couldn't see, but could feel everywhere. The air was growing thin, the walls of her life closing in. Third and final movement was the crescendo, the one designed not just to ruin her, but to humiliate her, to salt the earth of her reputation so that nothing could ever grow there again. It appeared online that afternoon, a blog post on a local gossip site, under the headline, "Small-Town Florists, Thorny Ambitions." It was a masterpiece of character assassination. Anonymous sources, fabricated quotes, and cleverly cropped photos painted a picture of Elara as a manipulative social climber. It alleged she'd had an affair with the mayor's son-in-law to secure the wedding contract. It twisted her humble background into a sob story she supposedly used to manipulate a guilt-ridden Leo. It even included a picture of her having a tearful lunch with a male friend after a fight with Leo, framed to look like a clandestine, romantic rendezvous. The post spread like a virus through their social circle. Her phone began to buzz incessantly with notifications, each one a fresh wave of nausea. Friends or people she had thought were friends were sharing it, commenting with shocked emojis and sanctimonious pronouncements. She was tried and convicted in the court of social media within an hour. She sat on the floor of her now-doomed shop, surrounded by the beautiful, dying flowers, the scent of their decay a sickeningly sweet perfume. She was numb, a hollowed-out shell of the woman she had been that morning. That was how Leo found her. He didn't rush to her side. Divente old. He stood in the doorway, his face pale, his jaw tight, holding his phone like it was a weapon. The gossip blog was glowing on the screen. "Is any of this true?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth she so desperately needed. "Leo, look at me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "You know me. You know this is a lie." "Do I?" He shot back, and the coldness in his voice was more painful than anything she had read online. "My mother, se warnev?" She said, "You are an opportunist. That you were just using me to climb." I called her a liar. "I defended you." He paced the small space, running a hand through his hair, a man unraveling. "And now this, a zoning violation. Suppliers pulling out. This filth. It's a disaster, Elara. My family's name is being dragged through the mud." Her heart shattered. He wasn't seeing her pain. He was only seeing the reflection of his family's shame. Eleanor's poison had finally worked its way into his heart, and he was seeing her through his mother's eyes. "Your family's name," she whispered. Disbelief warring with a tidal wave of grief. "Leo, my life is being destroyed. My business, my dream, everything I've worked for is gone. My reputation is ruined. And you're worried about your family's name. It's not just a name," he yelled, his voice echoing in the empty shop. "It's my legacy. It's everything. My mother was right. You're a liability. I can't do this anymore." The finality in his words was absolute. Look at her, at the woman he had promised to love and protect. And all she saw in his eyes was the cold, calculating judgment of his mother. He had made his choice. He turned and walked out, the little bell above the door chiming a cheerful, mocking farewell. Elara didn't cry. The capacity for tears had been burned out of her. She simply sat there, as the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the floor that looked like bars of a cage. She had lost her business. She had lost her friends. She had lost her husband. She had lost everything. The Empress had issued her decree, and the execution had been flawless. Rock bottom wasn't a sudden, violent impact. It was a slow, grinding descent into a gray, featureless landscape of despair. Elara's new reality was a cramped, one-room apartment on the city's frayed edge, a place where the sirens never seemed to stop and the walls were so thin she could hear her neighbors' lonely coughs through the night. The sun, which had once been the defining feature of her life, barely penetrated the grimy, single window that looked out onto a brick wall. The air was thick with the ghosts of other people's lives, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and boiled cabbage. Her gilded cage had been replaced by a concrete tomb. The first few weeks were a blur of numb autopilot. She moved through the motions of survival, eating cheap instant noodles, sleeping on a lumpy mattress on the floor, staring for hours at the water-stained ceiling. The silence was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all thought. It was broken only by the echoes of what she had lost. Every scent, every sound was a trigger. The smell of rain on hot pavement reminded her of the day she and Leo had been caught in a downpour, laughing and soaked as they ran for cover. The sight of a couple holding hands on the street sent a shot of ice through her heart. She'd see a delivery truck from her old flower supplier and have to duck into a doorway, her breath catching in her throat until the wave of nausea passed. Her business, the Bloom Box, was a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there. She would wake from dreams where she was back in her shop, the scent of fresh-cut eucalyptus in the air, her hands arranging a cascade of peonies. The waking world was a cruel, colorless shock in comparison. The betrayal was the deepest wound, a poison that seeped into every memory, tainting it. The love she had believed to be the cornerstone of her life now felt like a grand deception. Had any of it been real? Or had she just been a temporary diversion for Leo? A project to be discarded when it became inconvenient? She tormented herself with these questions in the dead of night, scrolling through his social media on a cheap, second-hand phone. His life, it seemed, had continued uninterrupted. There were pictures of him at a gallery opening, smiling his easy, charming smile. A photo of him at a Vancroft family event, standing next to his mother, the perfect, dutiful son. There was no sign of grief, no hint of the cataclysm that had torn their lives apart. To the world, and apparently to him, she had simply vanished. Her own social media was a wasteland. The initial flurry of shocked and venomous comments on the gossip blog post had faded, replaced by a deafening silence. The friends who had once filled her life with laughter and support were gone. Some had sent awkward, pitying texts before disappearing. Others had simply ghosted her, their silence a tacit confirmation that they believed the lies. She was a pariah, a ghost haunting the edges of a life she was no longer a part of. Financially, she was destitute. Eleanor had been thorough. The joint account she shared with Leo had been frozen and then emptied, her name surgically removed. The small business account for the Bloom Box was drained by legal fees and penalties from broken contracts. She sold her jewelry, even the delicate gold locket Leo had given her, on their first anniversary, just to make rent. The humiliation of it was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. She was 32 years old, and she had nothing, less than nothing. She had debt, a ruined name, and a heart so thoroughly broken she wasn't sure it could ever beat properly again. One rainy afternoon, as she was sorting through the single box of belongings she had managed to salvage from her old life, her hand closed around a small, velvet pouch. Inside was a flash drive. It was a heaf from Leo from a time that felt a century ago. It was loaded with pictures from their wedding, their honeymoon in Italy, their life together. A morbid curiosity, a desire to punish herself further, made her plug it into the ancient, borrowed laptop she had. She clicked through the images, each one a fresh torment. There they were, clinking champagne glasses on a balcony in Florence, his arm wrapped tightly around her. There she was, laughing, her face tilted up to his, the picture of idyllic, happiness. There he was, asleep, his face peaceful, the man she had trusted with her entire soul. The grief was overwhelming, a physical weight that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The tears she thought had dried up long ago began to fall, hot and silent. This was the true depth of her loss. It wasn't the money or the shop or the social standing. It was the loss of that woman in the pictures, the one with the bright, hopeful eyes, who believed in love, in dreams, in the fundamental goodness of the man beside her. That woman was dead, and Elara was just a collection of ashes and echoes, a ghost living in the ruins of a life that had been stolen from her. Despair has a gravitational pull. It draws you down into the dark, convincing you that the silence and the shadows are where you belong. Elara had been sinking for weeks, the crushing weight of her new reality, a relentless force. She was at the very bottom, in the cold, airless void where hope goes to die. She had decided to erase the last vestiges of her past. The flash drive, still plugged into the laptop, was the final, painful link. Her finger hovered over the delete button, ready to obliterate the smiling ghosts of her former life. But something made her pause. Instead of deleting the photos, a different impulse took over. She started clicking through the drive's other folders, a meaningless, mechanical act of procrastination. Most were empty, but one was labeled Leo's archive. He had used the drive once to transfer some old work files from his personal laptop. He was notoriously messy with his digital life. It was a long shot, but she opened it. The folder contained old architectural renderings, project proposals, and a subfolder named Personal. Her heart gave a painful thud. She knew she shouldn't look. It was a violation. It was an exercise in self-torture. She did it anyway. Inside were mundane document stacks, receipts, travel itineraries, and a backed-up email file. It was a single quotes .pst file, an archive of his emails from over a year ago. It would be useless. Still, the old email client on the laptop sputtered to life, slowly populating with messages from a happier time. She saw emails between her and Leo, planning trips, sharing silly links. It was excruciating. She was about to close it when Ascenda's name caught her eye. Eleanor Vancroft. A cold dread washed over her. She clicked on the name, and a thread of conversations appeared. The subject line of the first one read, "The Elara situation." Her blood ran cold. She opened Italiano. The email was from Eleanor to Leo, dated 6 months before the destruction of her life. It was written in Eleanor's signature style, elegant, articulate, and utterly chilling. Leo, my son, it began. We must speak plainly about the unfortunate alliance you have forged. While your affection for the girl is noted, she is not, and never will be, one of us. Her presence is a dilution of our family's legacy. We need to sever this unfortunate connection before it becomes a permanent liability. A clean break is required. Elara's breath hitched. She scrolled down, her hand trembling so violently she could barely control the mouse. Leo's reply was weak, pleading. Mom, I love her. She's my wife. You can't ask me to do this. Eleanor's response was swift and merciless. Love is a fleeting emotion. Legacy is forever. I am not asking you. I am telling you what must be done to protect this family. If you are not strong enough to handle it, I will. The thread continued for weeks. It was a blueprint for her annihilation. Eleanor detailed every step with cold, strategic brilliance. I have a contact in the city's zoning department who owes me a favor. A small, unresolvable violation should be enough to terminate her lease. Another email read. I will leverage our position with the Dutch import-export guilds. Her suppliers will dry up overnight. And then, the most damning of all, I have commissioned a writer, a specialist in online reputation management, to create a narrative that will make her departure seem inevitable and justified. A touch of infidelity is always effective. We will need to be careful with the timing to ensure maximum impact. Leo's resistance crumbled with each successive message. His replies grew shorter. More this feels wrong. Is this really necessary? And finally, the email that broke what was left of her heart. Fine. Do what you think is best. Fine. 2 letters. The surrender of their marriage, their love, their entire life, together, in a single, cowardly word. Elara stared at the screen, the words burning into her retina. The truth was so much worse than she could have ever imagined. This wasn't a tragic misunderstanding. It wasn't Leo being weak in a moment of crisis. It was a premeditated, calculated execution of her life, and her husband had stood by and let it happen. The grief that had been drowning her 4 weeks suddenly began to change. The immense, soul-crushing sadness began to boil. The water turned to steam, the steam to pressure, until it erupted in a single, clarifying blast of pure, cold fury. The tears stopped. The trembling in her hands ceased. She sat up straighter, her spine turning to steel. The victim, the ghost, the broken woman who had been weeping on the floor a moment ago, was gone. In her place, something new and terrifyingly calm was forged. She thought of Eleanor, sitting in her mansion, confident in her victory, having successfully swatted away a minor inconvenience. She thought of Leo, moving on with his life, absolved of his guilt by his mother's power. They thought they had erased her. They thought they had won. A slow, cold smile spread across Elara's face. It was a smile that did not reach her eyes. Her eyes were like chips of ice. They had buried her, yes, but they had made a fatal mistake. They had forgotten that she was a seed. She saved a copy of the email thread to a new, encrypted drive. She then methodically deleted the archive file from the laptop, erasing any trace of her discovery. She stood up and walked to the grimy window, looking out at the brick wall. It was no longer a prison. It was a training ground, a place to plan, a place to build. Her mind, once foggy with grief, was now raised. She began to dissect the Vancroft Empire not as an outsider, but as an insider. She knew their routines, their vanities, their secrets. She knew Eleanor's obsession with her public image, her reliance on a small circle of trusted allies, the skeletons in the family's financial closets that were only whispered about after the 3rd glass of brandy. They had taken her life, a life of sunlight, flowers, and love. She would not try to get it back. You can't rebuild a home that was rotten from the foundation. No, she would do something else. She would become their greatest nightmare. She would move through their perfect, gilded world. Like a ghost, a poison they would never see coming. She would not just take what they had. She would dismantle their legacy, brick by painful brick. She would make Eleanor, the Empress, watch as her entire empire crumbled into dust, orchestrated by the very woman she had dismissed as a quaint little hobby. In the silence of her tiny room, Elara made a vow. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, chilling promise she made to the woman she used to be. I will not be a victim. She whispered to her own reflection in the dark glass. I will be the reckoning. The phoenix was done burning. It was time to rise from the ashes. Transformation is a quiet process. There is no flash of light, no clap of thunder. For Elara, it was the slow, methodical shedding of a skin she no longer needed. The soft, hopeful woman who believed in the best in people was packed away with the ghosts in the deleted photo folder. The woman who emerged was leaner, sharper, and moved with a newfound, deliberate purpose. Her days were no longer spent drowning in grief, but structured with the discipline of a soldier preparing for war. She traded her cheap apartment for an even smaller, more anonymous room in a boarding house on the other side of the city, a place where no one knew her name. She took a menial, cash-in-hand job washing dishes at a diner, the long, grueling hours a welcome distraction. The steam and the clatter of plates were a shield for her thoughts, allowing her to plan in anonymity. The rest of her time was spent at the public library. It became her command center. Surrounded by the hushed reverence of books, She used the public computers to become an expert in all things She devoured years of financial reports from Eleanor's holding company, Vancroft Consolidated. She studied the society pages, memorizing the names and faces of Eleanor's inner circle. She learned about their charities, their investments, their rivalries, and their vanities. She was no longer just the former daughter-in-law. She was a student of her enemy's anatomy, searching for the precise location of the jugular. Her first target had to be perfect. It couldn't be a direct assault. That would be clumsy and traceable. It needed to be small, precise, and deniable. It needed to look like bad luck. The opportunity presented itself in the form of the annual Starlight Gala, the crown jewel of Eleanor's charitable endeavors. It was an ostentatious display of wealth disguised as philanthropy. And for Eleanor, it was the most important night of her social calendar. Her control over the event was absolute. From the floral arrangements to the seating chart, her obsession with perfection was her greatest strength. And Elara knew it was also her greatest weakness. Elara remembered Eleanor boasting about her exclusive caterer Patricia's Patisserie, a company renowned for its flawless execution. 4 weeks, Elara, using a burner phone and a fake name, called the patisserie, posing as a prospective client for a large event. She spoke to junior staff, asking innocuous questions about their suppliers, their staffing, their preparation schedules. She learned they sourced their prize beluga caviar from a specific single importer, and that their main kitchen was undergoing a minor, unpermitted electrical upgrade that was being kept off the books to avoid inspection delays. This was the vulnerability she needed. 2 days before the gala, Elara made 2 anonymous calls. The first was to a notoriously ambitious food blogger known for his scathing reviews. Posing as a disgruntled former employee of the caterer's caviar importer, she spun a convincing tale about a recent temperature control failure in their storage facility. She hinted that a batch of compromised, though not necessarily dangerous, caviar was being quietly pushed to high-profile clients to avoid a costly recall. She didn't offer proof, only a juicy, reputation-damaging rumor. The second call was to the city's health department. She reported a possible unpermitted construction and electrical work at the patisserie's address, mentioning concerns about food safety standards. She knew a surprise inspection was the one thing that could throw a wrench into Eleanor's meticulously planned timeline. The first stone had been cast. Now, all she could do was wait and watch from the shadows. On the night of the gala, Elara sat in her small, bare room, a cheap laptop open on her knees, monitoring the event's social media hashtag. The first signs of trouble appeared around 8 p.m. A guest posted a picture of a sad-looking canapé with the caption, "Guess the Starlight Gala is on a budget this year." Hashtag Starlight Gala 2023. Hashtag Where is the caviar? Double quotes. Then came a post from the food blogger she had tipped off. He was live tweeting from the event, hearing whispers of a last-minute catering change at the Starlight Gala. The replacement canapés are inspire. Rumor has it the original caterer had a run-in with the health department this morning. The story unraveled beautifully. The health inspection, timed for the busiest prep morning, had derailed Patricia's Patisserie completely. They were forced to cancel the Vancroft contract at the last minute. The replacement caterer, scrambled together in a matter of hours, was a disaster. The food was mediocre, the service was clumsy, and the main course was served cold. The carefully curated illusion of effortless perfection was shattered. Te gossip. Columnist from the city's main paper, a woman who had always been a rival of Eleanor's, had a field day. Her column the next morning was merciless. Starlight, starbright. Gala was a fright last night. The headline blared. It detailed the cold food, the cheap wine, and the general air of chaos. It subtly mocked Eleanor's fall from grace, framing the disastrous evening as a sign that the Vancroft matriarch was perhaps losing her touch. Elara read the article, a small, cold smile touching her lips. It was a minor victory, a paper cut, not a mortal wound. But it was significant. It had tarnished Eleanor's public image, embarrassed her in front of her peers, and, most importantly, The source of the chaos was completely untraceable. It was a series of unfortunate events, a stroke of bad luck. No one would ever suspect that the ghost of Elara, the disgraced former daughter-in-law, was the one who had set the dominoes in motion. In her mansion, Eleanor would be seething, firing assistants, and berating her staff. She would be furious at the caterer, the columnist, the world. But she would be looking in all the wrong directions. She would be looking for a rival of her own stature, a peer from her own world. She would never think to look down into the ashes from which Elara was beginning to rise. The first stone had found its mark, and Elara was just getting started. The Starlight Gala fiasco had been a public embarrassment, but Elara knew that social humiliation was a wound that healed. To truly dismantle an empire, you had to attack its foundations. Money and trust. The second phase of her campaign would be quieter, more insidious, and far more damaging. It required a deeper dive into the Vancroft archives, not just the ones she had stumbled upon, but the ones spoken of in hushed tones at family gatherings she had been forced to attend. She recalled a tense conversation between Eleanor and her husband, Leo's father, years ago. It was about an investment in a small, privately held biotech firm called GeneSynth Innovations. Leo's father had been against it, calling it a moral gray area. But Eleanor, ever the gambler, had pushed it through. Elara started digging. From her library terminal, she spent weeks mapping out Vancroft Consolidated's labyrinthine corporate structure. She traced shell corporations and offshore accounts until she found it a significant, controlling interest in GeneSynth, hidden behind 3 layers of corporate veils. The company was on the verge of a major breakthrough in genetic therapy, but their research methods were controversial. Skirting the edges of medical ethics, they were Eleanor's secret cash cow, a high-risk, high-reward venture that the publicly traded Vancroft Consolidated would never openly admit to backing. Elara's strategy formed. She couldn't expose the connection directly. That would lead back to her. Instead, she had to make the investment itself toxic. She created a new online persona, a supposedly retired financial analyst with a passion for forensic accounting. She started a small, anonymous blog on a niched financial forum, writing insightful, well-researched pieces on other companies to build credibility. After a month, she published her magnum opus, a detailed 5,000-word expose on GeneSynth Innovations. She didn't mention the Vancrofts once. Instead, she laid bare the company's questionable research practices, its inflated revenue projections, and the potential for catastrophic legal liabilities if its methods were ever made public. The report was a masterpiece of data and insinuation, filled with charts and technical jargon that made it look utterly professional and irrefutable. She then used a small amount of her dishwashing money to buy targeted online ads, ensuring her blog post appeared in the feeds of financial journalists and biotech industry analysts. It took 3 days. A reporter from a major financial news network, sniffing a scandal, picked up the story. The headline was devastating. The ticking time bomb in biotech. Is GeneSynth Innovations the next tier? The fallout was immediate and brutal. GeneSynth's private valuation plummeted. The impending public offering was cancelled. More importantly, the article mentioned a mysterious, silent partner funding the operation, sparking a wildfire of speculation. Vancroft Consolidated SA stock took a 15% hit in 2 days, as investors grew nervous about the company's potential exposure to the scandal. Eleanor was bleeding millions, and she had no idea where the attack had come from. While the financial firestorm raged, Elara began to unravel the tapestry of Eleanor's social life. She knew that Eleanor's power was built on a network of alliances with other wealthy, influential women. This circle, held together by mutual benefit and shared secrets, was her true throne. Elara decided to turn them against one another. Her primary target was Beatrice Sterling, a woman as old and powerful as Eleanor, and her closest confidant for over 30 years. Their friendship was legendary, but Elara knew it was riddled with professional jealousies. From her time in the family, Elara remembered that Eleanor had once secretly outbid Beatrice for a piece of art they both coveted. using a proxy buyer to hide her involvement. It was a petty, vindictive move that Eleanor had gloated about in private. Elara crafted an anonymous email. It was short, cryptic, and designed to look like a mistakenly forwarded message. She sent it to Beatrice's personal assistant, a young, ambitious woman Elara knew was eager to climb the social ladder. The email contained just enough detail about the auction, the name of the proxy buyer, the final price to be undeniably true. It was a seed of doubt planted in the most fertile ground. Asterisk, just confirming the final wire transfer for the Eleanor will be thrilled. Beatrice never knew it was her. Discretion is, as always, paramount. Asterisk, assistant, seeing an opportunity to gain leverage, would surely show it to her boss. The betrayal, though years old, would feel fresh and deeply personal. It would shatter the trust that had been the bedrock of their long friendship. Elara followed this by targeting another of Eleanor's allies, a real estate mogul named Catherine. Elara knew from Leo that Eleanor often disparaged Catherine's new money taste behind her back. Elara sent a similar anonymous tip to a gossip columnist, detailing some of Eleanor's most cutting remarks. The column, published a week later, didn't name Eleanor, but referred to a certain old-money matriarch who privately mocked her supposed friends. The description was so specific that everyone in their circle knew exactly who it was. The effect was magnificent. Paranoia swept through Eleanor's world. Her closest friends suddenly grew distant. Beatrice Sterling was giving her the silent treatment, refusing her calls. Catherine was openly hostile. At a charity luncheon, whispers followed Eleanor everywhere she went. Alliances frayed, long-held secrets were being weaponized, and she couldn't identify the traitor in her midst. Her perfect, orderly world was descending into chaos. In her mansion, Eleanor Vancroft was no longer the serene, untouchable empress. She was becoming isolated, suspicious, and increasingly erratic. She was a queen under siege in her own court, fighting shadows, while her financial empire and her social standing were being systematically unraveled by a ghost she never even knew was haunting her. The emotional cost of her vengeance was a debt Elara paid every night in the silence of her small room. The cold, methodical strategist she was during the day gave way to a woman haunted by the ghost of a love she had once believed was real. To execute the next phase of her plan, she had to do the one thing she dreaded most. She had to see Leo. Her campaign had wounded Eleanor, but it hadn't been a killing blow. Consolidated was damaged, but not broken. Elara knew, from her deep dive into their financials, that Eleanor was pinning all her hopes on a single, massive, secret deal. A merger with a clean energy tech giant called Vanguard Industries. The deal, codenamed Project Lifeline, would not only stabilize her company, but propel it into the future, erasing the damage from the GeneSynth scandal. The details were a closely guarded secret, known only to Eleanor and her most trusted inner circle, which included Leo. Elara needed those details. She knew Leo would be her weakest link. He was a man drowning in guilt, and she was the anchor he had cut loose. It was time to see if she could make him reach for it again. The transformation was crucial. She used what little money she had saved to buy a single, perfect outfit. A sleek, dark gray dress, elegant and understated. It was the armor of a woman who was successful and she had her hair cut into a sharp, sophisticated style. When she looked in the mirror, the heartbroken woman from the shabby apartment was gone. In her place was a stranger with eyes that held a chilling calm. She was no longer the wildflower. She was the polished stone. She orchestrated the chance encounter with meticulous care. She knew from his old calendar that he frequented a small, independent coffee shop near his architectural firm. She waited for 2 days, sitting at a corner table with a book, until he finally walked in. He stopped dead when he saw her, a jolt passing through him as if he'd seen a ghost. She looked up slowly, as if just noticing him, and offered a small, sad, knowing smile. It was a masterfully calibrated expression, conveying sorrow and acceptance, with no trace of the rage that simmered beneath her skin. "Leo," she said, her voice soft. He approached her table cautiously, his face a canvas of shock and guilt. "I didn't know you were still in the city. Where would I go?" she replied. The question, gentle but pointed. This was my home. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. He looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he had lost weight. Her campaign against his mother was clearly taking a toll on him. Too good. Can I sit down?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded. The conversation that followed was the most difficult performance of her life. She had to fight every instinct to scream, to accuse, to show him the emails and watch his world crumble. Instead, she played the part of the magnanimous victim. She didn't blame him. She didn't attack him. She spoke of her new life in vague, positive terms, hinting at a new job, a new beginning. "I've had a lot of time to think," she said, stirring her untouched coffee. "I understand the pressure you were under. Leah, your mother. She's a powerful force. I don't hate you. I just wish you'd been stronger." The words were like a dagger wrapped in silk. By absolving him, she amplified his guilt 1,000-fold. He flinched. Unable to meet her gaze, he began to stammer, to justify, to explain. "I never wanted. I didn't know she would go that far. I miss you, Ellie. Every day." The old nickname was a fresh stab of pain, but she didn't let it show. She kept her expression placid, compassionate. This was her moment. "I'm glad to hear you're doing well," she said, skillfully changing the subject. "The museum project looked incredible. Your work is more important than ever now. Imagine. With everything going on at your mother's company." He seized on the opening, desperate to prove his worth, to show her that the sacrifice of their marriage had not been in vain. "It's been difficult," he admitted, lowering his voice. "The gene synth thing was a nightmare, but we're about to turn it all around. Mom is finalizing a huge merger. Project Lifeline. It's going to save everything." "Project Lifeline?" she asked, her curiosity feigned and gentle. "It sounds important." And then it all came pouring out. Disarmed by her apparent forgiveness and his own desperate need for validation, he told her everything. He told her about the merger with Vanguard Industries. He told her about the secret negotiations, the timeline, and the public announcement, scheduled in 2 weeks at the Vancroft Tower. He explained how vital it was that Vanguard's board believed Vancroft Consolidated was financially sound, that they had no idea how close to the brink of collapse the company truly was. He was trying to impress her, the ghost of his wife, trying to prove that he was a key player in a world of high stakes. He had no idea he was handing her the executioner's axe. She listened, absorbing every detail, her mind a cold worry machine. When he was finished, she placed her hand over his on the table for a brief, calculated moment. His skin was cold. "I'm happy for you, Leo. Truly," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of sincerity. "I hope it all works out." She stood up, gathering her things. The encounter was over. She had what she needed. "It was good to see you," she said, her final words delivered with a chilling finality. She walked out of the coffee shop without looking back, leaving him sitting there, awash in his regret and false hope. The emotional toll of the meeting hit her the moment she was out of his sight. She leaned against a wall in a nearby alley, her legs trembling, and finally let out the breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. Seeing him, hearing his voice, had been like pressing on a fresh wound, but the pain was secondary to the cold, triumphant certainty that now filled her. She was no longer the woman he knew. She was no longer driven by the pain of his betrayal. She was driven by a single, icy purpose. The ghost of a husband had given her the final key. Now it was time to unlock the grand finale. The 2 weeks leading up to the Vanguard merger announcement were a blur of intense, feverish activity. Operated like a ghost in the machine, her small room lit only by the glow of her laptop screen deep into the night. Leo had given her the what, when, and where. Now she had to build the trap. Her first step was to understand Vanguard Industries. They weren't just any company. They were corporate darlings, lauded for their ethical practices and transparent governance. Their CEO, A man named Julian Croft had built his reputation on integrity. He would be pathologically averse to any hint of scandal. This was the fulcrum on which she would pivot her entire plan. The problem was, Eleanor was a master of concealment. The official financial statements she would have provided to Vanguard would be sanitized, scrubbed clean of any rot. Elara needed to find the truth hidden beneath the polished lies. She needed to prove that Project Lifeline wasn't a merger. It was a hostile takeover of Vanguard's reputation by a desperate, failing company. Her mind went back to the email archive. In it, she remembered seeing messages about an old, supposedly defunct server where Eleanor's late husband used to store his private files, the Vancroft Prime server. It was a long shot, but if there were any skeletons, they would be buried there. Gaining access was the challenge. She couldn't hack it directly, but she remembered Leo complaining about his mother's tea. Eleanor still used the same IT consultant she'd had for 20 years, a man named Arthur Gable, whose password security practices were notoriously lax. Elara began to build a digital profile of Arthur. She found his social media, his hobbies, his family. She learned he was a passionate amateur photographer who frequently posted on a niche forum. Posing as a fellow photographer, she struck up a conversation with him, praising his work, asking for advice on Over a week, she built a repo. Then, she sent him a seemingly innocuous Fila collection of prize-winning photos he could use for inspiration. Embedded in the file was a sophisticated key. It was a huge risk, but it paid off. 2 days later, Arthur logged into the Vancroft Prime server for routine maintenance. The keylogger captured everything. Elara had the credentials. The server was a digital graveyard, a time capsule of the Vancroft dynasty's darkest secrets. And Elara had the key. For 3 sleepless days and nights, she sifted through decades of data. What she found was more damning than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't just one fraud. It was a pattern of deception stretching back years. She found 2 sets of books, the official, public ones, and the real ones, showing massive, hidden debts and liabilities. She found evidence of insider trading, of backroom deals that had ruined smaller competitors. She found proof that Eleanor had systematically pushed her own husband out of the company in the years before his death, consolidating her power by falsifying reports and undermining his decisions. This wasn't just about saving her company. It was about preserving a legacy built on a foundation of lies. Elara began to assemble her dossier. It was her life's work, a monument to her vengeance. She compiled the falsified financial reports, the incriminating emails between Eleanor and her accountants, the evidence of the secret gene-synth liability, and the chilling email thread detailing the premeditated destruction of her own life. She organized it all into a clear, irrefutable narrative of deceit, complete with a timeline and an executive summary. It was a corporate kill shot. The day of the announcement arrived. The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the Vancroft Tower. The entire financial world would be watching. Eleanor would be on stage, triumphant, ready to declare her victory and secure her legacy. Elara sat in her room, the city humming below her. She was calm, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. She had 3 emails drafted and ready to go. The first was to Julian Croft, CEO of Vanguard Industries. The subject line was simple: what you need to know before you sign. The second was to a hand-picked list of the most influential financial journalists in the country. The subject: the truth about Vancroft Consolidated. The third was a formal submission, with all the attached evidence, to the Securities and Exchange Commission's whistleblower portal. At 1:55 p.m., as Eleanor Vancroft was likely taking her place behind the podium, her face a mask of serene power, Elara set up a delayed send command for all 3 emails. The delivery time was set for 2:15 p.m., the precise moment when, according to the press schedule, the ceremonial signing of the merger documents would take place. Everything was on the line. Her meticulous research, her risky gambles, her entire campaign of quiet, unseen warfare, all led to this single, digital key. She leaned back in her chair, the emails queued, the trap set. She thought of the woman she was a year ago, Crying on the floor of her ruined shop, she thought of the cold fury that had been forged in the crucible of that betrayal. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. It was about a final, undeniable act of self-reclamation. She had been erased, but she had learned to write her own ending. The clock on her laptop ticked to 2 p.m. The grand finale had begun. The grand ballroom at Vancroft's tower was bathed in the cool, blue-white light of television cameras. The air hummed with anticipation. Eleanor Vancroft stood at the podium, a vision of triumph, in a power suit the color of blood. Beside her sat Julian Croft of Vanguard Industries, his expression one of polite, corporate optimism. To the world, this was the dawn of a new era. A brilliant strategic merger that would create an industry titan. To Eleanor, it was the culmination of her life's work, the final, unassailable seal on her legacy. She smiled for the cameras, a picture of grace and power. Today, we are not just merging two companies, she began, her voice smooth and confident, resonating through the hushed room. We are forging a new future, built on a shared vision of innovation, integrity, and strength. In her small, anonymous room across the city, Elara watched the live stream, her face impassive. The clock on her screen read 2:14 p.m., 1 minute to go. On stage, aides brought out a large mahogany table and 2 leather-bound document folders. The ceremonial pens were produced. Eleanor's smile widened. This was her moment of vindication, the silencing of all her critics. At precisely 2:15 p.m., as Eleanor reached for her pen, a single phone buzzed in the front row. It belonged to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. He glanced at it, his eyes widening. A moment later, another phone buzzed. Then another. A quiet, electronic chime rippled through the press corps, a digital plague spreading through the room. A murmur started, a low hum of confusion that quickly grew into a wave of frantic whispering. On stage, Julian Croft's chief aide rushed to his side, his face pale, and handed him a tablet. Croft frowned, taking it. As his eyes scanned the screen, the color drained from his face. The polite corporate mask dissolved, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock, which quickly hardened into icy fury. He stood up abruptly. The scrape of his chair was unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense room. He didn't look at Eleanor. He didn't say a word to the press. He simply turned and walked off the stage, his entourage scrambling behind him. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters were shouting questions, cameras flashing like a violent electrical storm. Eleanor was left alone at the podium, her hand hovering over the unsigned document, her triumphant smile frozen on her face. She looked utterly lost, an empress suddenly stripped of her robes, standing naked and confused before the entire world. The trap had been sprung. The aftermath was a corporate apocalypse. The Vanguard deal was dead. The SEC announced a full-scale investigation into Vancroft, consolidated within the hour. The company's stock was halted, but when it reopened the next day, it was a bloodbath. The value was wiped out in a matter of hours. The empire that had taken a generation to build was annihilated before the end of the week. Weeks later, the Vancroft mansion felt different. The manicured lawns were slightly overgrown. A for sale sign was staked near the Gran Intran. Inside, the cavernous rooms were filled with packing boxes and draped in white sheets, like a mausoleum waiting for its final occupant. Eleanor Vancroft, dressed in simple gray slacks, was taping a box shut when the doorbell rang. She opened it to find a woman she barely recognized. It was Elara, but not the timid, broken girl she had exiled. This woman was poised, her eyes clear and cold, radiating a quiet, unshakable strength. "What do you want?" Eleanor rasped, her voice rough with defeat. "I came to see the ruins," Elara said, her voice even, without a trace of malice or triumph. She stepped inside, uninvited, and looked around at the shrouded furniture. Recognition, followed by horrified disbelief, slowly dawned on Eleanor's face. "You. It was you. The gala, the stocks, the emails. It was all you. You took my life, Eleanor," Elara said, her gaze finally locking on to the older woman's. "You thought I was just a weed to be pulled from your perfect garden. Never imagined I would be the one to salt the earth." Eleanor stared at her, speechless. All the power, all the arrogance had been stripped away. She was just a tired, defeated old woman in a house full of ghosts. "Why?" Eleanor whispered. "For revenge." At first, Elara admitted, but it became about something else. It became about balance. "You built a legacy on lies, and I exposed it with the truth. You said me, so I erased you. Where even?" Elara looked at the woman who had been her greatest enemy, and she felt nothing. The burning rage was gone. The cold need for vengeance was sated. There was no joy in this victory, only a profound sense of closure. She had done what she had set out to do. She turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor alone in the echoing emptiness of her crumbled kingdom. Elara didn't look back. As she walked down the long driveway and back into the sunlight, she felt the immense weight she had been carrying for the past year finally lift from her shoulders. The revenge was over. The ghost of her past was She wasn't the broken woman in the ashes, nor was she the cold phoenix forged in fury. She was simply Elara, and for the first time in a long time, she was free. Free to build a new life, a smaller, truer life, on a foundation that was entirely her own. The sunlight felt foreign. As Elara walked away from the Vancroft estate, the warmth on her skin was a sensation she had to consciously register. Like a language, she was slowly remembering. For the past year, she had lived in the shadows in cramped, dimly lit rooms, behind the anonymous glow of a laptop screen. Within the cold, calculating architecture of her own mind, the sun was for the woman she had been. The woman who lived in a light-drenched apartment and dealt in the vibrant currency of petals and leaves. That woman was gone. The woman who walked down the long, curving driveway, away from the silent, imposing mansion, was someone else entirely. She had expected to feel something monumental, a surge of triumph, a cathartic release of a year's worth of condensed rage, or perhaps the bitter, metallic taste of victory. Instead, there was only a profound and unnerving quiet. The space in her soul that had been occupied by a singular, all-consuming purpose, the absolute destruction of Eleanor Vancroft, was now a cavernous void. The intricate machinery of her revenge, which had whirred and clicked ceaselessly in her mind, had ground to a halt. Its silence was deafening. She didn't look back at the house. She didn't need to. The image of Eleanor, small and withered amidst the shrouded furniture of her fallen empire, was permanently etched into her memory. Seeing her enemy not in a blaze of fury, but in a state of quiet, pathetic ruin had been the final, necessary act. There was no joy in it. There was only the stark, dispassionate finality of a debt paid in full. It was, as she had told Eleanor, about balance. An eye for an eye, a life for a life, a legacy for a legacy. And now, it was over. Elara walked 4 miles without a destination, letting the rhythm of her footsteps on the pavement guide her. The city, which had once been a gilded cage and then a hunting ground, now felt like a neutral territory. The faces of strangers passing by were no longer potential threats or obstacles. They were just people, living their own stories, oblivious to the epic war she had just single-handedly won and concluded. She found herself at the entrance to the city's greenest park, the very one she and Leo used to overlook from their apartment balcony. For a moment, a phantom pain lanced through her, a memory of laughter, of wine shared under the stars, of a love she had believed to be indestructible. But the pain was different now. It was no longer a fresh, gaping wound, but the faded, silvery scar of something that had happened to another person a long time ago. She found an empty bench beneath the shade of an old oak tree, and sat down watching the world move on without her. Children chased pigeons on the grass, their shrieks of laughter piercing the afternoon calm. An elderly couple shared a newspaper, their shoulders gently touching. Life, in all its mundane glory, was happening all around her. She had been so focused on the death of her business, her marriage, her old self that she had forgotten what simple living looked like. She had become a ghost, haunting the edges of a world she had once so fully inhabited. But the confrontation with Eleanor had been an exorcism. The ghost was finally free to go. Who was she now? She wasn't the naive, trusting florist who had been so icily broken, nor was she the cold, merciless strategist who had risen from the ashes. That persona, the reckoning, had been a suit of armor she had forged and worn out of necessity. It had protected her, empowered her, and allowed her to do what needed to be done. But it was heavy, and it was cold, and it was not who she was meant to be. Revenge had been a tool for transformation, a crucible to burn away the weakness and the pain, but it was never meant to be a destination. The fire had done its work. Now, she had to learn to live with the woman it had forged. Her thoughts drifted to Leo. She pictured him, adrift in the wreckage of his family's name, forced to confront the consequences of his own cowardice. The burning anger she had once felt towards him had cooled into a distant, detached pity. He was not a monster. Was simply a weak man, a boy who had never learned to stand outside his mother's formidable shadow. He was a victim of his own gilded upbringing as much as she had been. In the end, Eleanor's poison had claimed him, too. Forgiving him felt unnecessary. He was simply irrelevant now. A closed chapter in a book she was no longer reading. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the grass, a familiar scent drifted on the breeze, the smell of damp earth and fresh-cut flowers. It pulled her to her feet, an instinct she couldn't ignore. She followed it to a small, pop-up farmer's market at the edge of the park. And there it was, a small stall, not unlike her very first one, overflowing with buckets of hydrangeas, peonies, and wild, untamed ferns. The air around it was a heady perfume of everything she had once loved. For a year, that scent had been synonymous with pain, a reminder of the dream that had been stolen from her. Now, as she breathed it in, something inside sifted. It was the first true, unburdened breath she had taken in a very long time. She approached the stall slowly. A young woman with soil under her fingernails and a passionate light in her eyes was wrapping a bouquet for a customer. She moved with a familiar, loving efficiency that Elara knew intimately. The woman looked up and smiled at her. "Find you something beautiful." "Say." Husked. Elara reached out and let her fingers graze the soft, velvety petal of a deep crimson rose. It was real. It was beautiful, and it was hers. Not the flower itself, but the love for it. That was the one thing Eleanor had never been able to touch. Her business had been a building. Her marriage had been a contract. Her reputation had been a social construct. All of it could be taken, but the passion, the artistry, the innate connection to the untamed beauty of the natural world, that was the core of her soul. And it had survived. "Just looking," Elara replied, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't sadness. It was a kind of profound, aching relief. A homecoming. She walked away from the market as dusk began to settle over the city. She knew what she had to do. Back in her small, anonymous room, she packed the few belongings she owned into a single canvas bag. She took the remaining cash she had, the meager wages from months of washing dishes, and laid it out on the bed. It wasn't much, but for the first time, it felt like enough. It was a beginning. Her last stop was a small, all-night garden store. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, she bypassed the showy, cultivated blooms. She walked to a rack near the back and found what she was looking for. A small, simple paper packet. On the front was a vibrant illustration of a chaotic, beautiful explosion of color. The label read, "Wildflower Mix." She held the packet in her hand, the tiny seeds rattling within. They were seeds of resilience, of untamed and unpredictable beauty. They didn't need a manicured garden or a wealthy patron to grow. They just needed a little patch of earth and a chance. They were just like her. Clutching the packet of seeds in her hand, she walked out of the store and toward the distant lights of the bus station. She didn't know where she was going, and for the first time, the uncertainty felt not like fear, but like freedom. The revenge was done. The past was a landscape of ash, but from ash, new things could grow. Stronger things, wilder things, truer things. She was Elara, and her real story was just beginning.